Well, hey everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, or I don't know what time it is wherever you are, but the joys of the internet, we kind of be wherever. So today we're going to talk about the Microsoft patterns and practices and how we utilize those within SharePoint Online and SharePoint. So a little bit about me first. My name's Liam. I'm a founder and owner of a small consulting company. I've worked in infrastructure and security and cloud and development and all kinds of different things over the past 20 years or so. I'm also a Microsoft MVP for Office servers and services, as well as a Microsoft certified trainer. And I also like to run. I like to do those crazy runs where you run through the night and do things like that too. So that's me. So what we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about three specific things. We'll talk about SharePoint patterns and practices first, and then we'll move into what's referred to as SharePoint P&P, and then we'll move into Office Dev P&P. So the goal is to kind of go through what this is and how you could utilize it and the different components that kind of make up that. So first off, let's talk about patterns and practices itself. So what is patterns and practices? Now, we've obviously heard this phrase 1,000 times when it comes to, like, if you're a software developer and you're building something, there's going to be patterns and practices that you're supposed to follow in order to make code the best thing and things like that too. Now, for the patterns and practices that we're going to talk about, it's broken into three core pillars. So the first one is guidance. So this is patterns and practices information or guidance given to you by Microsoft and others that kind of work on these projects to help you build what would be the best way of deploying a SharePoint server, let's say, or building a web part that can be utilized in SharePoint Online. So for example, I'm actually working as part of the guidance team, and I'm actually writing some security guidance as part of the patterns and practices. It's part of a community-driven thing where there's a couple of people in Microsoft that kind of own everything, but really it's left down to community people to kind of add that content. It's also about modernization. So really the objective of the patterns and practices initiative is really to get you from where you are now in the easiest and course the best supported way of doing it. So there's lots of guidance around modernization. So for example, if you're building a component in the SharePoint stack on premises, let's say you're in 2013, 2016, and you want to move the custom components that you've made into Office 365, there'll be guidance and examples around modernization. And then, of course, there's community content. So this is content from all over the world, from all different individuals, some of them like me, so fellow MVPs or certified trainers, or just people that want to give back to the community. You don't get any payment for this, it's all free. And then what happens is outside of that is there's free training. So you can join community calls, you can go into the patterns and practices sites now, which is now officially moved into the Microsoft documentation, and there'll be videos, tutorials, documents that kind of run through examples and things like that too. So Microsoft really kind of almost, if you think of the idea of open source, so the idea of open source is that obviously there's a community that kind of works around whatever the product might be to make it better. And so this is Microsoft's attempt to kind of build a kind of almost structured open source type idea so that you can then get, further along in developing something by utilizing the best practices. Now, the patterns and practices are built up into these kind of four buckets. So there's a SharePoint GitHub repository, which stores documentation, samples, code samples. For example, if you want to download a specific web part that's been built, then you can go to the GitHub repository to get that. There's also a P&P GitHub repository. Now, they do kind of work together. So the P&P one is really wrapped around what referred to as the Office Dev. So it's more of the underlying components, whereas the SharePoint one is really focused on the SharePoint components. Then, of course, I mentioned before community calls. They have them every single month. There's a couple of them at least. And really, it's a chance for individuals in the community who may have built a solution, utilizing P&P, want to demonstrate it and say, hey, you guys can have it now and, use it as your example. And then, of course, training. And then this little character right here, that's the official logo of the patterns and practices. So whenever you go there, you'll see this little image floating around, and Microsoft have lots of stickers that they give out. But this is the Microsoft official patterns and practices kind of icon that you would see. So in the GitHub repositories, obviously we have two. We have the SharePoint one and then the PnP one. The SharePoint one contains 47 projects, and actually that keeps updating as well. It's available at github.com/SharePoint. And then the PnP one has 18 projects, and it's available at github.com PnP. Now, you can also go to the Microsoft documentation site, and what you'll find is sometimes when you click the link, so just be aware these do change frequently. So they may update and you'll click a link today, but it won't work tomorrow, but it will redirect you to where you're supposed to go. So different types of projects. Remember, PnP is really around the main core engine. So for example, there's a provisioning engine that's part of one of the projects that's in the PnP side, and then the SharePoint side will have the web parts and components. Now, from a PnP support perspective, just be aware that these assets are created by Microsoft and the community. They're maintained by Microsoft and the community. It uses supported and recommended techniques that are defined by Microsoft. However, it's not an official Microsoft product, and therefore you don't get support from Premier Support. So just be aware, if you're trying to utilize that and you have an issue, you can't go and ring up Microsoft support and say, hey, can you fix my PnP thing? They'll just send you back to the PnP forums and the community to kind of get answers to those questions. Okay, so let's have a look at the GitHub repositories then. So let me just open up a browser here. So I'm actually just going to go to github.com/SharePoint. Now, of course, when you get to the SharePoint GitHub site, if you've ever used GitHub, you kind of know how this would kind of work. You're able to browse through the types of repositories that are available. So we have the pin section at the top. This will be the same for the PnP. And you can see that at the top, Microsoft, who owns this, have pinned the dev docs, the SPFX training, the training web parts, extensions, and basically everything that would get you started on building something. So if we click into SP Dev Docs, for example, this will then scroll down to the SharePoint framework documentation. It gives you the framework releases, and you can click and see the notes. If you want to go and see the official documentation, then you'll see the URL is a little bit different. So I'm going to open in a new tab. And what this does, this has officially been moved over to docs.microsoft.com now. So when I go to the SharePoint framework, you can see all of the content here, external libraries, web parts, extensions. This is all content that's built out and created here. So if I click in docs, for example, you can see all of the categories listed here. They match to the categories that are over here. So this is where we create all of the content. Now, if I go back to the SharePoint level and go further down, you'll see that we've got this kind of breakdown of different things that have been created. Some of them are starter kits, some of them are just documentation, some of them are full-blown solutions that we can download. So for example, you'll see we've got the training SharePoint framework React fabric. If I click into here and go down, you can see we've got some PowerPoint documents, and if I click in demos, there's some demo web parts. So I can say dynamic web part, and it has the source code, which you can take and you can then utilize. The nice thing about it being in GitHub is that you're able to go through any of these and clone the repository down so that you can then utilize that. So for example, if I wanted to take the provisioning templates, you can see I can go to here, say clone or download. I can say download a zip file, and it will basically batch up all of this, and then I have a copy of it locally on my machine. Now, if we change from the PnP, from the SharePoint one, sorry, to the PnP one, what you'll see is we get a few other different things. I noticed the icon's got that new PnP, but this is Microsoft 365 patterns and practices. So we get the product here, which is PnP.js, which is owned by a guy, Patrick, at Microsoft. Then we've got the Office 365 CLI, which is a cross-platform CLI that we'll talk about. And then we get kind of 4 of the big ones here. So the generator, which lets you build SharePoint framework components. The Teams generator for generating custom components for Teams. Then we've got PnP Powershell, which is Irvin's baby. And then we've got PnP Sites Core. So all of these are core projects in their own right. And then, of course, as we scroll down, we can see there's even more available to us. So, for example, you want to do some list formatting in SharePoint. If you go to Dev List Formatting, this is one I sent someone to the other day, and go to Column Samples, you can see that there's lots and lots of folders of people that have created samples for column formatting. So, for example, if I want to have a Bing map that shows up in some text. You can see that I'm going to have Denver office and it will list something here. It shows you exactly how to do that. And it even shows you, if I click onto the JSON, it'll give you the JSON that you need to use as well. So it's a great way of being able to enhance on-premises and cloud. Now, I will say that lots of the PnP components are not necessarily designed for on-premises. So you will have to go through and figure out which pieces work. Like clearly the Office 365 CLI isn't made for on-premises SharePoint. However, you run this on-premises. P&P Powershell, on the other hand, can be used for on-premises and the cloud. The framework generator for both also. Teams, obviously cloud, because there's no Teams on-prem. So you just need to be aware that you'll have to figure out what you're trying to do and which pieces of the P&P you wish to utilize. Okay, so let me just go back here. Okay, so let's talk a bit more about the SharePoint P&P then. So the core projects in the SharePoint P&P are really around these kind of 5. So you've got SharePoint Framework client-side web parts. So this is SPFX. So this is the new way of building web parts where we write them in client-side code, kind of like back to old school way of doing it, where you're writing JavaScript effectively, utilizing some frameworks. Then we have the SharePoint Framework client-side extensions. So this was a fairly recent one that was added probably back end of last year, where it allows me to, for example, add a header and a footer or a custom navigation. Effectively, it's a way of you injecting something into the page. Then, of course, we have PowerShell, which is one of my favorites. I use that all the time. Then we have Sites Core, which is part of the glue that stitches everything together for connecting to sites and provisioning. And then we have what's called the starter kit. So, for example, there's like an intranet starter kit where you can then download that and deploy that into your Office 365 tenant, and it will give you a starter intranet with some base components, some web parts, and things that you can utilize. Now, of course, one of the first ones that I want to talk about is PowerShell. So what is it? Well, the PowerShell P&P has support for SharePoint on-premises and SharePoint Online. Currently supported versions are 2013, 2016, 2019, and online. And then also there's support for dedicated Office 365 if you happen to be one of those individuals that has that, and then also the government cloud. Now, what they are is a wrapped up version of the CSOM and the RESTful APIs. Now, the reason these were kind of made is that the out-of-the-box PowerShell, though it works great, has some limitations. It's limited to the CSOM and the REST type calls or the server-side object model if you're using on-premises, and basically the methods that have been exposed for public access. So when I want to, for example, I'm using Office 365 and using SharePoint Online, I'm going to say new SPO site. That's going to go ahead and provision me a new SharePoint Online site. Now, what about if I wanted to provision a new SharePoint site utilizing a template and then deploy components directly into the site automatically? See, now we don't have a single PowerShell commandlet to kind of do some of that. Or maybe we have to use a mix of technologies. So we have to use PowerShell to create the site, then we have to kind of write more custom PowerShell using CSOM. Maybe we have to call the RESTful API. Maybe we even have to call the graph to do things too. So the P&P PowerShell has packaged those things up into what can often be just a single or just a couple of different calls, but instead of having to write lines and lines and lines, we just pass in specific pieces and it does all the hard work for us. Now we can download these from that Microsoft website. It's from the docs.microsoft.com. We can go there and then download them. We also have the ability, if we're trying to install them either using the setup files that we download from that URL, or we can use the PowerShell gallery. So if you've never used that, that's the ability to use PowerShell, launch the PowerShell window and then say install module, and then it will go to the PowerShell gallery using NuGet packages under the cover and try to install that. We also have an installation script approach where there's a public PS1 file that is available on GitHub. So if you needed to do it that way, then you could actually just do an invoke install and then download the PS1 file and it would do the rest for you. So how do we install the PowerShell P&P? Well, if we want to install the SharePoint Online version, we're going to execute install-module SharePoint P&P Powershell Online. So really straightforward. They kept the naming convention simple. Then, of course, we have install for SharePoint 2019, which would be SharePoint P&P Powershell. And then instead of it being online, it's 2019. I'm sure you can guess what 2016 is going to be, and also 2013. Now, just be aware, not every PowerShell commandlet works the same across all of the versions. So the SharePoint Online version can sometimes be a little bit different because there's obviously different properties and different functions and features that are available. Whereas the on-premises ones, some of those won't work that are available in 2019, they won't work back in 2013. But they're all documented, so you can go to the P&P site, click on a function, and you'll be able to view whether it's available in all of them or some of them. Exactly the same way as Microsoft has documentation now. For example, when you're working with Exchange, it'll clearly say Exchange on premises or Exchange online. So how do we get started with it? Well, the first thing we need to do obviously is install. So let's say we installed the SharePoint P&P Powershell Online one. So I'm going to run install-module. Now, if this is the first time you've done this, it will launch a request to do with probably NuGet updates, and then it will also do what's called PS repository, and you'll just need to confirm yes to those, and then it will be able to install the module. It's actually a great way of writing PowerShell, is to use PowerShell ISE, and then to use install-module to kind of install those things as you need to. And then, of course, you can import the module if you need as well. If we wanted to connect to SharePoint Online using just standard credentials, so I'm going to be prompted for a username and password, I can then use Connect P&P Online versus using Connect SPO Online, which is the way, or SPO Service, which is the way that out-of-the-box SharePoint does it. I then pass in the URL, and I'm launching credentials at this point, and then I can get access to it. Now, if we did have multi-factor enabled, we have support for that too. So we can just say connect P&P Online, pass in the URL, and then do /use web login. And this will force the web browser to open, where we can then complete the authentication at that point. Now, there are other ways of doing this too. And we can also do device authorization and certificates, but these are the two most common ways of authenticating into SharePoint using the P&P. Okay, so let's go onto my machine again, and we'll look at using the P&P. Now, by way of information, I'm just using PowerShell ISE. This is a Windows 10 machine. It doesn't have SharePoint installed, but the commands that I'm going to use are going to be the same that we would utilize wherever. So I'm using a test Microsoft tenant. So I have my username, I have my test tenant name. I also then have a test user account that I want to utilize as well. So let me just launch my other window here so I can get my credentials, and then we can connect. Okay, so the first thing I want to do, I'm just going to select my variables just to make sure they're populated. I'm always a great advocate of just double checking and making sure that the values are exactly as they are, because I've seen PowerShell not do this before. So always double check your variables. Trust me, when you're building large PowerShell files, you'll be grateful that you went and checked everything. So I'm going to say install SharePoint Online, and I've got the word force at the end because I know I already have it installed. If I do force, it will then force it to install. And so you can see it's downloading the package now automatically. Now, obviously, this does require internet. Now, of course, I don't get prompted for the NuGet. I don't get prompted for the PS repository because I already went through that process first. So that's installed the modules now. Now, of course, what I'm going to do here is I'm then going to import the module into my existing session. So I'm going to say import, and it does it really quick because I already have it there. So you can see that I've installed and imported the module. Now, there may be times when you start to use this that an update has come out. You may not have realized there is, but you can simply run update module, and then whichever the version, whether it's 2019, 2016, or online, you can just say update module going forward. So there's no need to reinstall it every time you have to do something. You'll just be able to do an update and it will just load. Okay, so let me scroll a bit further. So let's say that we wanted to connect to SharePoint Online. So I'm going to just pass username and password. So what I'm going to be able to do here is I'm just going to cut my password here, and I can say credentials, get credential, and pass in the username object. So I'm going to select this here, and this will then prompt me for like a message that I want to pass, or it's going to ask me for something else. So I'm just going to type a message, and then it's going to prompt here for that, and click OK. Now, did it populate? Well, let's have a look at the creds object. And sure enough, I have a creds object. Now, of course, I could have got away from the message one by just saying, please enter password, like so. So standard PowerShell syntax here, this isn't PnP, so I can do this again. You'll see it doesn't prompt me for a message this time, it just asks me to put credentials in, and I can check that my credential object is working. Okay, so what we then want to do is connect to my SharePoint Online site. So if I just go to my browser here, and I'm going to click on my communication site. So here's my SharePoint URL. So I'm going to browse to this specific site. That's the one I want to get to, but I want to connect to that utilizing P&P PowerShell. So let's go back here. And I've got my creds object, and I've got my tenant variable, which I always like to double check, remember? Just go back and say, yep, there it is. And I'm now going to say connect P&P Online, this URL with these creds. Okay, now notice there was nothing that came back. So I don't know if anything has returned, I'm not sure. So what we can do is if we type connect P and get P&P, you'll see that we can kind of tab through the bits and pieces. One quick way of seeing if you have a connection is to do get P&P context. So if I just select get P&P context, you'll see it's going to come back and say, yep, there's a correlation ID, we connected, we have a connection to it, this is the time and the date, etc. So context is just a way of saying, did you get a connection? Now, once I do this, we have a couple of ones that I want to look at. The first one would be new P&P user. So this is going to say, well, are we going to create a new Office 365 user, or are we adding a user somewhere? So just be aware that there's not a P&P copy or an updated version of some of the PowerShell commandlets that are out of the box. So for example, if I do new user, login name, and click enter here, it says there's a new user. Now, what does that mean though? Did it really add it as a 365 user? No, it didn't. And I put that there because I wanted to show you. So the new P&P user doesn't create a new user. What it does, it basically adds the user to what used to be called, and what it's still called, the user info list inside SharePoint. So in my SharePoint Online site, where I would have context of that, it's just added me into the user info list, which means that then SharePoint knows who I am and I can then be utilized. What I could do, however, is add me as a site collection administrator. Now, of course, you may be wondering, how is this working? Because at no point am I having to pass the URL. And that's because the way the P&P commands are written is that if I do connect P&P Online and then pass in the URL, that connection is tied to that URL. So if I do get P&P site and then just execute that one, I didn't have to pass the site because in the context of the PowerShell that I'm using, it's already there. So this is the nice thing about them, is that once you have a connection, it's going to flow it through every piece that you try to run afterwards. So I could say add me as a site collection admin. So I'm going to execute this one here. If I then go back to my site here, and I'm in my new modern, so I'm going to say site information, go to view all site settings here for this specific communication site that I have, and go to site collection administrators, you'll see that I've got my P&P user has now been added because that's my account, and I did that utilizing PowerShell. Now, of course, we also have the ability to find things. Now, I really like these ones because you want to obviously sometimes find content and you don't want to utilize search, or you want to just do it outside here. So I can say, go and find some files in the documents container and show me them if they match the document extension. And sure enough, you can see I've got some document ones here that have come back. Really, really quick way of just being able to find content. Now we could also create objects. So let's say I'm going to create a brand new list here as an announcement. I execute, it's done. If I go back here and go to site contents, you'll see that my test list is now created, and I can then create announcements. So we can utilize PowerShell, the P&P, to kind of not only update, but also add, remove, etc. Now, I'm not going to create the term sets, but there is a create term group, term set, and terms. I really like this. I actually just wrote a big PowerShell script the other day that will take a bunch of files that have values in from an external database, and then we use P&P term set and term groups and terms to populate the taxonomy values. Now, you can also do things like this too. So I can actually update properties on specific sites. So not only does it cover, adding things and deleting things, it's also allowing me to set values within those sites or multiple sites, whatever you've connected to. So that was some basic examples of how you can use the P&P Powershell to kind of connect to various things. Okay, so let's talk about Office Dev P&P. So this is a little bit different to the PowerShell one. So the core projects here are really based around reusable client-side libraries, manage Office 365 and SharePoint framework, so tools such as the Office 365 CLI, and then the SharePoint framework project generators, and then of course the 365 CLI. These are the core projects that exist in the Office Dev P&P. Now, of course, we just saw it as P&P, so they've kind of got rid of that name, but it's still referenced as the Office Dev. The reusable client-side libraries is really focused around client-side code, for example. So if we look at these a little bit more, so the libraries side is really focused on JavaScript libraries, React.js controls, formatting samples, and then the starter kits. What's interesting here is that Microsoft do open source some of their web parts and controls that they actually make for the product in the cloud. So you'll often find that there are controls in there that are the out-of-the-box ones that you can now download and you can customize and then redeploy as a different type of component. From the framework side, it's really around the framework extensions and then, of course, the framework web parts. So there's only two options in the framework here, and I'm talking SharePoint framework. So that means I can go and build brand new web parts. I can build extensions such as headers and footers or injection into the page, utilizing the frameworks that are there. Now, to help us do this, there is a series of generators that are available. So we have the Teams generator, which obviously is quite popular at the moment because everyone's using Microsoft Teams. And so that is the generator for building Teams solutions that will sit inside Microsoft Teams because they do utilize the same engine. So effectively, if you build something in SharePoint Framework, the way you built it using SharePoint Framework is the same that you kind of build it for Teams as well. But you get the SharePoint Framework generator, which will do the web parts and the extensions. And then, of course, there's a Visual Studio SharePoint Framework extension as well. So if you are a hardcore dev and you want to use Visual Studio instead of Visual Studio Code, which is the common way of doing it, then you can use that extension instead. Now, the Office 365 CLI is kind of bolted into this. So what is the 365 CLI? Now, if you think about it, if you've ever gone into Azure, recently, well, over the past while, there's an Azure CLI that's available, and it's available inside the browser as well. So you can go into the Azure tenant, click on the button at the top, and it launches the CLI like a command window at the bottom in the browser where you can perform various actions. I actually really like using the Azure CLI. I built some scripts for a project recently where I was able to provision resource groups, as well as all of the networking infrastructure, security policies, and all the virtual machines and everything I needed by just writing a series of lines for CLI. Instead of me having to write extensive PowerShell, the CLI can actually be a little bit shorter. So the Office Dev CLI was a project that came around because, I use a Mac, I use a Windows machine. I also use a Linux machine sometimes. And so I want a way to be able to manage my Office 365 tenant and SharePoint by utilizing a common platform. Because right now, I can't really manage, Office 365 utilizing PowerShell on a Mac because it's not fully feature rich yet. So the idea behind it is that this is the wrapped up version of all of that. So it's cross-platform. So it works on Windows, Mac, and Linux. I actually use it on my Mac as well, and I have it on a Windows machine as well. You can use any command line tool. So once it's installed, you can utilize that. If you're using Bash or Commander, which I like to use, PowerShell itself, you can kind of load it in and utilize that. You also have the ability to manage SharePoint Framework projects, as well as other bits and pieces in the Microsoft 365 stack, such as Azure AD, the Microsoft Graph, etc. as well. Now, if you wish to utilize this, the installation steps are this. So we're going to say npm I, G for global, and then go @PnP Office 365 CLI. Then we'll type Office 365, and then we can type login at that point, and that will then ask us to go through a login process. So let's go through and have a look at how this works inside my Windows machine. So we're going to install and use the Office 365 CLI just to have a quick look, and then we'll look at how we create a SharePoint Framework project and what that looks like. Okay, so we're back on our machine. So I'm going to minimize my window here. And then what I'm going to do is just launch Commander, which I have open here. And then I also have a PowerShell window. Now we can use either of these. It really makes no difference of how we want to install those and what we kind of want to utilize with it. Now, in order for us to utilize any of these, so for example, installing the CLI obviously requires some specific components to have already been installed. So the first one for this is that we have to have Node installed, so Node.js. That can be downloaded from the Node.js website. And then what you end up with is if I just type Node, you end up with Node.js as an installed option. There's also a Node.js command prompt, which we can use. But actually, once it's installed, we can tend to load it in most things. So I'm in PowerShell here. And if I just type Node-V, it tells me I'm using Node version 10. If I go to the window behind, which is Commander, I can do the same thing. But Commander's a nicer interface, which I personally prefer utilizing. Now, if I wanted to install anything, then I'm going to utilize npm. So npm is the package manager. So I'm going to say I-G, and then this weird syntax that we use, this at something. We also utilize this for the SharePoint framework generators and the team generators. It'll say at Microsoft/something. So I'm going to say Office 365-CLI. So what that does when we use the at something before the name, when it goes to the cloud registry or the npm registry, it will identify what we're looking at by this combination. So the at PnP goes to the PnP container, and then Office 365-CLI is a subcomponent. So I'm going to click enter here. So what it will do is it goes and does a check to the internet. It does a bunch of magic, and then you can see it comes back because I already had it installed. And it just says, hey, we found an update. So we've updated one of those. So I'm actually just going to clear that. Now, I already have this installed in the other one. Now, of course, the way to actually get into it is we say Office 365, which I'm going to type here. So it becomes a command. Now, in PowerShell, it looks really bad because it goes like a dark red. But if I'm using Commander and type Office 365, we'll wait for that to load. You can see it goes red, but you can kind of see it a little bit better. I know it's like a strange thing, but it just loads it in red, and it gives me what looks like an old bash prompt or a command prompt. Now, at that point, I can type login, and then login will say, why don't you open the browser and try to authenticate with a specific thing? Now, I'm not going to obviously do that, but what that will do is that will let me try and log in to that specific session. So what it does, it'll say login, go to the browser, you'll be asked to authenticate with that code, and then once you have the code, you'll be able to then access certain specific things inside the actual tenant that you've connected to. Now, you'll have to specify that. Now, you don't need to pass the URL. You just basically need to say, this is my credential, and I'm able to authenticate at that point. So let's go and try this. So if I say login here, I'm going to go and copy my code here, which I'll need to get. And we do that. Okay, and then I'm going to go to HTTPS Microsoft Device Login. So let me go to my here. Okay, device login. And then it's going to say, what's the code? So I'm going to paste my code here, click next. We'll wait for this to complete. Now, of course, when we look at this, you can see that I have no sign-in process here. But what'll happen is you can see it comes back and it says, well, which account? So I'm going to say this one because I'm already signed into my tenant. So we'll just go back to here. It'll then say, which permissions do you wish to assign? And of course, you have to accept all of them, otherwise it won't let you kind of do anything. So I'm going to say accept. And we'll just load this in back here again. You can see it's still spinning in the background. Okay, so my consent has been done. If I now go back here, it'll say you have signed into the PnP, and then obviously it repasted my syntax here, but now I'm authenticated to my Office 365 tenant. And so that's the easiest way of actually connecting to it. So you go out and you browse and you do the things that you need to. Now, while we're here, let's say we wanted to know what the commands would be. There are commands that are for SharePoint Online. So I can say help SPO, and you'll see it lists me the names that are available. So there's a command that says SPO list. There's a command that says SPO page. So if I go and say SPO list, oops, if I do help SPO list, that would help. Okay, it gives me the options. So you can see everything that you would want to do, you can kind of add. So if I go in and say add, I want now help for the add. And sure enough, it comes back and says, okay, there's a whole host of information you can say add with, and this is kind of how it works. And it gives you some basic examples of how that project can be added. You can then copy those, obviously. So I'm going to copy it. And then I'm just going to open up Notepad here, my trusty Notepad, and I'll just paste that there. So you can see it says I'm going to add demo list, and it's going to add into a specific site. Now, of course, this isn't my URL. My URL is this communication site here. So I'm going to copy my URL, go back into here, and I'll just get rid of that, paste in my URL, get rid of my test links here, etc. And then I'm going to copy that back to my window. So let me just enter here, paste it in, and then go enter. Now, of course, it did it. It came back and responded. So did it actually create it? Well, let's go here. And sure enough, you can see my demo list has been created, and it was done using Office 365 CLI. Now, the nice thing about that is it will work cross-platform, irrelevant to whether that was performed on a Mac, a Linux machine, or something else. It will functionally work as expected. So we have the ability to create specific things as well. Now, of course, if we wanted to log in to something else, for example, straight to Azure AD, we could do that. We can also do the different type of login. So I just typed the word login, but I could actually have typed login. I tell you what, let's just look at the help one here so you can see the syntax. So help SPO, and you can see it'll come back and say we don't really have any specific help that's available because we don't need to do any logins, but you can see the breakdowns here. So it'll say SPO. So you just need to be aware that not every feature or logging command or whatever has a corresponding function that you can utilize. So, but what you will notice is if I say help here, you'll notice that we have groups that we can access. So instead of just doing SPO, we've got SharePoint Framework, we've got Outlook, we've got Graph, we've got Flow, we've got all kinds of different things. We even have teams. So for example, I could go ahead and create a brand new Microsoft team. So I could say Graph. I could then say teams. I could then do add. And then I could say test team, description, test team. And then, of course, I can go through and obviously generate. I actually pressed the wrong button. It deleted it. But that's the syntax that we can utilize. We could also just utilize the teams option, which is the command group. So if I just get rid of this one and just say help teams, you can see that we've got teams apps, reports, tabs, team users, etc. But notice that the teams one doesn't have the ability to add teams, and that's because we have to use Microsoft Teams for that. So that's just a quick run through of how the Office 365 CLI works. Now, I'm just going to come out of this one, and we'll clear this one for a second. Now, the second thing I wanted to look at was the SharePoint framework. Now, the SharePoint framework has obviously been around for quite some time, and it allows you to build specific web parts or components. Now, I'm actually just going to come out of this folder a little bit, and what I'm going to do is make a new directory, and we'll call it training, and then I'm going to go into that training folder. And then what I want to do is I want to create a new project. So what we do is we utilize the word yo, and we say at Microsoft SharePoint. And what this will do, this goes ahead and then connects to the generator that's installed for generating web parts. And you can see it pops up and it says, what's your solution name? I'm going to call it training. What do you want to do? Well, do you want to do SharePoint 2019, SharePoint 2016? Now, the key here is whichever one you choose will dictate the amount of code that's already in the predetermined scaffolded project. So I'm just going to say SharePoint Online. I'm going to use the folder I created. And it's going to say, do you want to allow the admin? I'm just going to say no. And will the components? No. And then it says, well, what am I creating? Am I creating a web part, an extension, or a library? I'm just going to say web part for now. and we'll call it Hello World because obviously that's the coolest name. I'm going to keep the description. I'm going to use React as the JavaScript framework, and then I'm going to click OK. And you can see this is going to go ahead. Now this, depending on your internet connection, can be fast or slow. It just depends on how it's being built. So you just need to be aware that it can take some time to do this. It's not the fastest because it's having to download all of these core components and basically scaffold the project that you're going to be utilizing. So we'll give this a second to go. But in the meantime, I already have one open, which I've already opened in Visual Studio Code. So I'm actually just going to go to Visual Studio Code. Now, when we've generated the project, right from inside Commander or whichever console you're using, you can just, if you have code installed, you can just type code space and then a dot, and then that will open up whatever's in that folder. So you can see I have the structure here where it's got some package information, all of these JSON ones, if I just click on one, so you can see, have all the list of dependencies and things that are needed to make the project work. You don't have to mess with any of these. For just out of the box, the most important thing is the source folder. And then in the source folder, you will have what's called the manifest file, which is basically what describes the web part you're building. And then underneath that, we've got the TS file. The TS file is the core code for the web part. So what's it going to look like when it renders? And then over here, we have components, which are some other ones. So the SCSS contains all the CSS that you're going to use. The web part one has some base rendering of the web part, and then you have the properties that you want to expose in the web part. So let me just see if mine's finished. No, that's still going. So once we have this, then we can obviously go ahead and make modifications. For example, if I wanted to add a different property, and what I mean by a property, if you've ever used SharePoint in the past, you'll know that you can edit a web part, and then there's properties that need to be filled in. So you can utilize this same mechanism by adding a property here. Then, of course, you have to expose the properties over here, and then you basically reference them here. So it seems like it's really complicated, but actually it's using just standard JavaScript mechanisms for building code. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so my one's finished. So what I'll do is just to show you, I can say code dot, and this will launch me a new instance of Visual Studio Code. And you can see I've got my project. And if I go to source and web parts, you can see my Hello World one, which is the one that we're going to use. So I'll just go here. Now, let me go back to here. The idea behind building them is that they're cross-platform. So I could be building this on a Mac. I don't need access to the SharePoint environment unless I want to consume data. So what we have is we have this idea of utilizing something called gulp, which is a mechanism for building tasks. So I can say gulp something. So if I say gulp, and I'm going to say serve, gulp serve is what will take this code and open it in a web browser so we can actually look. Now you'll see what happened. It launched my web browser, but I'm actually just going to go back to here so you can see this. You can see it started compiling everything. You can see there's subtasks and it's loading, and it will keep loading. And in the background, you saw it load. So what we end up with is what's called the SharePoint Workbench. So a way to test the components that we're building. So for example, I can click on the plus and you'll see we get the standard text, and then you get my Hello World. If I click Hello World, it adds the web part to the page. If I now click here, edit the web part, you can see I get the details. So I can say test message, and you can see updated exactly here. I also get the ability to say, well, I want to preview that of what it would actually look like. I can edit it. I could say, show me in a tablet view, and you can see it has a rendering of a tablet. If I also wanted to say, well, I want to put it in a phone, what does that look like? And then you can see that it's using this type of model. I can click between the different types, so Samsung or something else. So you have the ability to see what it looks like within each one. I can then close that and go back to the main one. I can also then just get rid of it. I can also say, show me the web part data, and it will give me the modern pages, and then it will give me what the classic pages would look like if we were utilizing that there. So it's a great way of building something and being able to test that component before you actually deploy everything. So if we go back to here, if I want to come out of that, I can say yes and finish the batch job. Now, of course, if I refresh this, now that I've closed that down, you'll see that it just errors because it doesn't exist. So the key here is that you have Node.js running. you build the component, and then it pushes that component, launches it in a web browser, and then you're able to access that component. Now, you can, of course, modify any of these at any point. It's as simple as obviously going to here inside the code itself. So you can see I've got my web parts. If we go through, you'll see there's like no main text here. But if I go to my components and go to my properties, you can see the string value. If I go to Hello World, you'll see that it says, welcome to SharePoint, customize SharePoint, learn more. And then it has this description value, which is the property that we associated. So I could just say, get rid of this, welcome to the demo. And of course, what's nice here is I can just save that, and then I can actually just then say gulp serve, and I can relaunch it instantly. Now, if we have the gulp serve still running, the nice thing is that we can change the files on the fly. And then what will happen is, so if I go back to my web part here, hello world, notice it says welcome to SharePoint, but that's because it's been cached. There you go, it says welcome to demo, so it catches up. But then what happens is, let's say we leave this running and we decide to make changes. So I've got that going. Let's say I go to Visual Studio here, and then I want to change that to say to the new demo, and I click save. Oh, that was the wrong button. I click save here. Now what you'll see is it suddenly starts doing a rebuild of that code, because there's flags here that say when you update, please go and change, and you'll see it now says new demo. So you get instant feedback in the build process when you're going through. Now this could be web parts, it could be extensions, it could be anything. So you have the ability to utilize the commander as a way of doing it. I'm just going to click yes for now, or you can do this from PowerShell itself. So if I just come out of my command, and go back to here and just clear the screen, I can also do the same. So if I type gulp, you'll see I'm in a PowerShell window, and it comes back and says gulp's not found. And that's important to know, because if it's not installed into the console, you will need to say install gulp, and then it will go ahead and do install. So you have to kind of choose the editor that you wish to have. But as you can see, it's really straightforward, because if I was having to build that with Visual Studio, I'd have to go and test it locally and then do something. But here, I can at least create, test, publish, and package. I can manage it, obviously, utilizing Node.js. I can utilize that. I could also go back and utilize PowerShell. I can use Office 365 CLI. I can use a whole raft of different things. And then, of course, Visual Studio is our editor of choice, or at least Visual Studio Code is the editor of choice. So the P&P obviously brings advantages to building specific things. So if we flick back to our PowerShell one, obviously from here, we can obviously perform various actions. We also have the ability to say, I want to do something with a SharePoint framework, for example. Okay, let me just come back out of here. Okay, so in summary, we talked about the patterns and practices, and obviously what was available in those different things. We also talked about SharePoint P&P and the core projects that are available in the P&P, and obviously what you can utilize, as well as walking through utilizing the PowerShell P&P to be able to do specific tasks. I highly encourage you to go ahead and use the PowerShell P&P Powershell if you're not using it. I spent hours of my life utilizing it. Then, of course, we touched on Office Dev P&P, where we focused on looking at the Office 365 CLI and what that can do from connecting to Office 365 and then making changes. And then, of course, we also looked at the SharePoint Framework component by scaffolding a SharePoint Framework web part so that we could then deploy that and test it inside the workbench. So the P&P changes the way that we would effectively work, because in the past, to be able to do any of this administration or any of the development, for example, for on-premises, you would need to have a SharePoint machine, as in a server, either in the production or dev or whatever, or a virtual machine built on your dev box to be able to do that. So I suppose in summary, my final thing is that we are now able to, because of things moving forward and because of the advancements in the P&P, be able to manage everything from a device that doesn't need to have SharePoint installed, that doesn't need to have Visual Studio installed. We don't necessarily need to have Windows on it. We don't need to necessarily have Linux or Mac. It doesn't really make a difference now that we can now manage and develop utilizing the P&P and the best practices that come from Microsoft. Because think about it, this patterns and practices piece has come from Microsoft. Their own software developers and admins utilize the P&P themselves. So thank you for attending. I hope it was useful for you. And if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat, and I'll give it a few minutes before we close everything out. Okay, if there's no questions, I'm glad that you enjoyed the session, and hopefully we'll see you at another one. Enjoy the rest of your day wherever you are.